Well, here it is, the long-awaited Canon EOS R7, and from the specs it looked like a dream camera for many bird and wildlife photographers with 32 megapixel APS-C sensor, which gives us this extra reach that we often need, the autofocus system inherited from the R3, and finally up to 30 frames per second. But there were also some concerns like the buffer size that was quite limited, and always the question, 32 megapixels on an APS-C sensor, how does the noise levels look like? And I now had the chance to test this camera for about a week now. I know that 1 week testing is not enough for a long time review where some of the small problems with the camera or little annoyances you only find out after several months or years. But still, I think I did some quite intensive testing. I took pictures of several mammals, birds, insects. And today I just want to share with you my experience, my thoughts about the camera, and also some of the pictures that I did. So I hope you enjoy the video. Let's start with the specs and the body design. I don't want to go into too many details here. I already mentioned the key things, but basically when I took the camera in the hand for the first time, I immediately noticed that it's quite smaller than my R5, and you can see this on the pictures. Is this something nice or not so nice? I would say it depends. First of all, I have rather small hands, so it's not too bad, and when coupled with an RF 100 to 500, which I was shooting a lot with, it's actually quite okay. But in general, I just prefer the bigger body here of my R5. I have more room for, I think it's called pinky in English. And when I was taking pictures with the EF 600mm f4 lens, I really felt that it's a bit too small and the whole combination felt a bit unbalanced. On the other hand, especially when going in the mountains, I really appreciated the lower weight. So this one weighs in at 612 grams. You will see the pounds in a second below. Whereas the R5 is 738 grams, and you can really feel the difference. And the R7 is also lighter than its predecessor, the 90D, which still was a DSLR. So there was of course the mirror and the optical viewfinder that was taking a bit of weight. If we look to the controls of the top of the camera, we can immediately see that the R7 is having this more traditional dial, which is now on the right hand side of the viewfinder, in contrast to, I think, the 90D, it was still on the left. I prefer the position here on the right because I can change it more quickly. On the other hand, in general, I prefer the electronic dial like it is on the R3 or on the R5. And I also need to say that I kind of miss this shoulder display on top of the camera. A few years ago I never knew why this was useful, but yeah, since I was using one for a while now, I caught myself quite some times now with the R7 looking at it and realizing it's not there, and I cannot quickly check the settings, which was sometimes a bit a bummer. So I just needed to look through the viewfinder again, because at least how I use the camera, I usually have the rear screen flipped in just for saving some energy and also protecting it from scratches. So yeah, this needs a bit of readjustment again. And if we look at the other dials, we can also see that on top now there is the on-off switch on the right side. So many people wish that they could access this easier and not having it here on the left side like as on the R5 and R6. For me this was never an issue. I'm not turning the camera on and off 100 times a day. But what is more an issue for me actually now is that we lack a third dial for changing our settings. So on the R5 we had this on the top, this on the back, and the second one here on the top on the back, whereas with the R7 we only have this one and the one here. So this means I cannot change my ISO anymore directly. I need to press this ISO button and then change it, which just takes a bit longer, is a bit more inconvenient because I need to take the finger off of the shutter, which can cost me time. And one workaround that you might suggest would be, why don't you use the control dial, or how it's called, from the lenses? There's two reasons. First of all, not all of my lenses are RF lenses, so not all of them have them. And the second reason is, let's say for the 100 to 500, I really like this lens, but The position of this control dial is so stupidly placed in my opinion, because if I'm holding the lens, I hold it here, and this dial is so too close to the camera that I cannot access this when I'm taking pictures. So I really missed this third dial, and I don't understand why Canon didn't put it there. Yeah, well, let's move to the back. Maybe there are some nice surprises here. And the nice thing is we still have a joystick. We have the big dial now, not around the set button, but rather around the joystick. It took me a little bit of time to get used to it, but once you get used to it, it's okay. I just found switching back from the R5 to the R7 a bit annoying, because the wheel is in a different position, but otherwise it's fine. I felt that the joystick, I could operate it a bit easier on the R5, but not a big issue. And if we move to the viewfinder, it has a bit lower resolution than the R5. It comes in at 2.36 million pixels, whereas this has 5.7 million pixels. And I got asked by some of you, how bad is the viewfinder of the R7 in the real world? I need to say, if you're used to the R5, it's a bit a step down. And I noticed it quite a bit when switching back and forth for the camera between both cameras, that first of all the resolution is lower, but also the contrasts are not so good, and the colors, it's a bit hard to describe, but it just looks a bit more digital, whereas the R5 looks more natural to me. On the other hand, after I used the R7 for a couple of days in a row, I didn't realize it so much anymore. So I think it's just a matter of getting used to it. Finally, the camera comes with 2 SD card slots, so you can write in parallel to have a backup. You can, of course, split images and videos on both cards and so on. It also comes with the same battery as the R5 and the R6, the LPE6NH by now. And I think battery life is a point. I was quite happy with the battery life. I had the impression it's doing maybe even a tiny bit a better job than the R5. So let's move to a really important step, image quality and noise. Well, if you compare the R5 to the R7, the R5 is obviously quite a bit better, because it has this full frame sensor and it's capturing more light. But as bird photographers, we often have the problem that we cannot get close enough to our subject, so we need to either put a tele extender or crop the image after. And I think this is also why many of you are interested in the R7, because of this extra reach. So I thought maybe an interesting test would be to take my R5 with the 600mm lens and 1.4 extender, take some pictures, and then from the same distance use the R7, but this time without the converter. So this means here we have 1600 ISO, whereas here we have 3200 ISO if we keep shutter speed the same, because we lose a step of light with the extender. And you can see the setup here. I cropped the images to have the same size, and if we zoom in a bit more, you can see that the detail is quite similar, even though I would say the R5 has a small edge in detail if you look in the middle of the feather. And noise levels are kind of similar, so I would say a slight edge for the R5 in this scenario. And for me it proves again that it's kind of, the teleconverters can still be useful, at least in some situations. And then I did a second test if you don't want to use a teleconverter for some reasons, because it can slow down the autofocus and if you use the R5 and the R6 from the same distance with the same focal length, of course, as you can see, the R5 image is way wider, so we need to crop in more, but now we're at the same ISO, the same shutter speed, the same aperture, the same everything. And I took a first picture with 400 ISO and cropped into the same view. And here I would say noise levels are again quite comparable. And if I looked at the detail, and I need to look really closely now, I would say also the details are quite comparable. So what I did was another test with a bit higher ISO, this time is 1600. And I would say again, it's quite comparable. I can really not see a big of a difference. And yeah, this was a bit what I was expecting. I expected that with the R7 we would see a bit more details, to be honest, but otherwise it's often about noise in APS-C cameras. Yes, if you compare them side to side to a full frame camera, where you can get close enough to the subject, then of course the full frame will be way better, and you can look up these tests on dpreview.com or whatever. But in a situation where we are focal limited and we would like to go closer or put an extender, then usually the R7 does not have a disadvantage. But it also shows me that with just using the R5 and cropping, I'm also not losing so much. And if we're using really high ISO on these APS-C bodies, what can also help is just to use a software like denoise from Topaz. I put an affiliate link below. For me, this really helps to clean up the images, as you can see with this ibex that I took with the R7. What I also noticed about the image quality when taking pictures in the field was that the sharpness was just not as constantly high as with my R5, and I kind of had the same experience already when I moved from the 7D to my 5D Mark III a few years ago. I just have the feeling that this higher pixel density is one reason why this could be the case, but I'm not 100% sure. I just felt with the R5 I'm just getting more consistent results, but still got plenty of nice ones with the R7. One thing I noticed really strongly is that when using the electronic shutter, the image was kind of warped or distorted from time to time, and I think this is the combination of the electronic shutter and the sensor, the slow sensor readout, combined with the image stabilizer, and this just leads to really distorted images. You can see it here with this alpine chuff, that the body dimensions are somehow really changing. I think in nature this is not a big problem, especially for animals. It might be more if you take pictures of forests, or if you're doing architecture, I think this would be really bad, but there you would probably also not take the electronic shutter. So it's just something I was already a bit annoyed with my R5, and I realized that with the R7 it's way more pronounced. You can just avoid it if you shoot in the mechanical shutter, of course. And since some of this didn't sound too good for the R7, I just wanted to show you some pictures that I took with it before we move on and have a closer look at the autofocus. So in general, the autofocus of the R7 allows more customization than the R5. It's closer to the one of the R3. And I will do a complete setup video of my R7 in about 1 or 2 weeks, where I show you all the settings that I changed so that I can use it the best for wildlife photography. So definitely subscribe to the channel and activate all notifications that you will not miss this video. In general, when I was comparing the autofocus of the two cameras, I actually felt they're quite similar. Maybe the R7 was having a slight edge, but to be honest, I didn't feel a huge difference. Maybe this is something you would notice more after using it really for a year or so. But I was already shooting with sun in my bag, with overcast weather, foggy weather, with backlit. And in all these situations, I had the feeling it was behaving kind of similar. So sometimes still having trouble to find the eye, just focusing, especially when taking pictures of mammals. It's often going for flowers or whatever. For birds, it's way more consistent. And as usual, once it has the eye, it's tracking it basically perfectly. One issue I had with my R5, and it's occurring with basically all mirrorless cameras, is that once the focus is stuck on the background, it has trouble to acquiring something that is in front, especially if it's small. And unfortunately, this is still the same with the R7. I was also expecting this, but I really hope at some point, maybe with the R1, we see an improvement here. The R7 shoots up to 15 frames per second in a mechanical shutter, which is a record for all Canon mirrorless cameras, and up to 30 frames per second in the electronic shutter, which is on par with the R3. So the question was, how long can it keep this up? And this is something I was really concerned when I read the specs from Canon, that if you shoot in RAW with 30 frames per second, it can only do 43 pictures in a row, which is not even 1.5 seconds of continuous shooting. And you can believe me, the first time I used the camera, I immediately hit the buffer because, yeah, holding it down for a bit more than a second is not so long if you have an animal that is moving. So what I did is I put it in 0, and there it was way better. It's getting over 90 images in a row. So this was kind of usable for me. I still hit the buffer once or twice, but I was actually, at least so far, pleasantly surprised of how it was working then. And of course, if you put it in the mechanical mode with 15 frames per second, the buffer is also lasting way longer. But even then, the R5 is just doing a better job. And also what I didn't like so much with the mechanical shutter was just that it's quite loud, and it's somehow louder than the R5. I was not expecting this. Of course, it's a bit faster, but I thought since the shutter itself is smaller, due to the smaller sensor, the sound would be less loud, but it's not the case. You can see this here in this clip, and what you can also see in this clip is how much longer the buffer of the R5 stays. And since this camera does not come with a stacked sensor, the electronic shutter comes with some downsides. Most importantly, the rolling shutter. And I did some initial tests to compare the R7 to the R5, and I used this fan. And you can see how it should look like when you use the mechanical shutter or first electronic shutter. And here you can see an image of the R5 and of the R7 with the electronic shutter, and you can see that we already have some distortion with the R5, but the R7 is doing way worse. So that's not a good sign, but how much of a problem is it in the real world? Well, I took some in-flight pictures of some insects, of some hoverflies, I think they're called in English, and please excuse me if some of them are not sharp. That was not really the point here. Just look at the wings. You can see that they're really having funny shapes, and trust me, I'm a biologist, they don't look like this in the real world. So here we have some problems with the rolling shutter. I was then also taking some flight pictures of birds, of terns and seagulls, and when I took pictures of them against the blue sky or water, there was no issue at all. However, when I had a gray heron flying upstream the river, there were some problems with the background. You can see all this Phragmites species in the background. The reeds, they are completely tilted, and I had the same when afterwards a merganser was flying the other direction. So this is something you should really watch out. If you have a background where you have trees, where you have reeds, whatever, this will look distorted super quickly. So there I would think twice, maybe take the mechanical shutter and just live with the only 15 frames per second. What I was really excited about this camera is this pre-capture function, or however Canon is calling it, where basically as soon as you half press the shutter, it's already pre-recording images and keeping always the last half second in the buffer. And once you press down completely the shutter, it's first of all taking pictures from then on, and the half second before, so this would result in 15 images because it's done with the electronic shutter, they also get recorded to the card. So this is super useful if you have a bird on a perch and you expect that it's taking off soon. Usually when I do this and take the pictures, I'm always too slow because my reaction is just too slow, and this would be a super nice option. So is it useful or is it just a gimmick? So one thing I didn't like so much is that these RAW files are not saved as normal RAW files, but like a sequence of RAW files. So when I open this on my computer, it looks like a 400 megabyte file or something. And as you might have already guessed, I cannot open this file in Lightroom directly. I either need to use Canon Digital Professional Photo to kind of extract single RAW files, or I can extract them on the camera directly. Both is a bit cumbersome, but it's a workaround, and I think I would use it in the situations where I really don't want to miss this sequence or this one shot. Just I would not leave it activated the whole time. Also because the viewfinder gets kind of laggy. I assume it's dropping down to the 30 frames per second that it's buffering. whereas usually it's having a refresh rate of I think 120 frames per second. But I think for these situations it's really cool. I just would hope that maybe Canon can improve this by firmware update, that it's saving all these files as like normal raw files so that you can use your normal workflow, because I would say most of us are not using Canon Digital Professional Photo. I don't want to go too much into video because I'm not sure how many of you are so interested in it, but basically the camera still has the record button up top here, like the R5, which offers you a quick access to the video mode, or basically instantaneous recording. And then you have the main video switch here. If you use this one, you can also use the C1, C3, MAV, whatever mode, so you're quite flexible. You have the autofocus in video and everything. The only thing I was missing is with my R5, I can shoot 120 frames a second 4K, which I do a lot to have these slow motion clips where I can slow things down, and that's not available on the R7, just like the R6. And I assume it's a limitation because this one is only having SD cards and not CF Express. So if you do a lot of slow motion, this is something to be aware of. Finally, I want to talk about some other things that I noticed when using the camera. So one nice feature is the automatic leveling of the sensor. So basically the camera makes sure for you that you are not having a crooked horizon or something. It's, I mean, to a certain degree, kind of adjusting the sensor. So even if you have the camera a bit tilted, the sensor will compensate for that and you will have a straight horizon. This is not working if you have the fast frame rate activated, so not super practical for wildlife or bird photography, but I really enjoyed using it for landscape photography. The camera also has a so-called optical viewfinder simulation. In the beginning I was not sure for what I should use this for, but it proved to be quite nice because it's providing a brighter screen, and this was nice to temporarily activate it when shooting in backlit situations. So basically I just put this on one of the keys that I can activate and deactivate it at any time, and I'm going to do a setup video of the R7 soonish, I would say next week probably. So if you don't want to miss that out, please subscribe to the channel and also activate all the notifications. What I missed a bit in terms of buttons was, well, some buttons I prefer to having more like on the R5. Just for example, there is no rate key that you can give star ratings to the images. I could have reassigned, for example, the set key or the AF on or whatever, but the problem is even if I can only reassign this once, I cannot reassign it differently for playback and shooting mode. So then I prefer to actually keep the keys that I have for different functions when I'm taking pictures. But that was a bit a bummer. Maybe also I missed something in the menu here, then please correct me. Also, something I didn't like is that I feel sometimes Canon is just crippling cameras on purpose. For example, on the R5 I can save all my settings to the memory card, which is quite useful. First of all, if I have two R5s and I want to sync the settings, and second, I can save all of them to the memory card before sending the camera in for a service, a repair or whatever, where all my settings could be deleted, so I can easily restore them, and the R7, just as the R6, are not having this function. One nice thing if you are doing macro photography is that the camera can do a focus stacking, everything in camera, so it's moving the focus and already creating this depth composition image. I'm going to do another video about this, so also stay tuned. And I think that was the most important parts about the camera. I really hope this review was useful for you, and at this point a big thanks to my friend Mail, another Swiss photographer, who was lending me her brand new R7 for about a week that I could test it. Just check out her website, it's also in the video description. And yeah, thanks for watching. As I said, the R7 setup guide will come, so all my settings that I use for wildlife photography specifically for this camera in about a week, so definitely subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications. And finally, I would be interested, do you already have this camera? Then what are your thoughts? Do you like it or not? What are your issues and the features you really appreciate? Let me know in the comments, and hopefully see you soon. Bye!